So firstly, welcome to the three of you. I think we're gonna keep this as a very fluid discussion, right? So just wanted to set not some rules, but just I guess ways of engagement. I'll be posing out made a few notes. I think Kenneth was saying you seem to have a long document. I was like, it's in a phone everything looks long, but just a few talking points. But I think the topic about how we're driving confidential collaboration across different verticals, really taking a deep dive given the experience that the panel over here has, specifically within telcos, ad tech, and potentially other use cases, and also getting a strong technology perspective would be super useful. So look, I'm really excited about this. As means of an introduction for the panel, I'll go first with Kenneth. And I have to read this out for everyone because it is a panel which comes with a lot of experience. So Kenneth, experienced architect and solution leader, demonstrated history of working in the telco and financial banking industry. He's been with Singtel for over a decade now. Yeah, over a decade. Leadership roles across different organizations, and currently is the head of client solutions and transformation at Singtel. He also spent a decade at Oracle and Sun Microsystems as a consulting lead and solution architect. Ben, really appreciate the presentation earlier. I think it was quite, it sort of set things up nicely for this discussion. But Ben comes from Meta, over 11 years of experience over there. He works at the intersection of advertising and privacy. He's one of the authors, so we talked about this, of the interoperable private attribution, and also is working on the proposal for private ads measurement. He actually had his own company, which he successfully sold to, or got acquired by Facebook. He ran that for 5 years. And then Guy, who's surprisingly not too jet-lagged, who's just literally coming straight from the airport. So he's the founder and CEO of SCRT Labs, the core development team behind Secret Network, which is a pioneering privacy-preserving smart contract blockchain. And he's also founded Finex. He's also served as a research assistant at MIT Media Labs, authored several influential papers, and created Enigma, a decentralized computation platform, guaranteed privacy. Holds an MS degree from MIT and is currently also a PhD candidate there. So look, long introduction, great panel. I'm super excited to hold this discussion. So thank you for coming in. So let's just dive straight in. I think we had a couple of interesting, one good discussion in the morning, and then also Ben's presentation. I think one thing which is becoming a really hot topic, and I'm not going to only just talk about AI, we can bring in AI later, but a topic which is becoming extremely important today is data collaboration, right? And how there are different forces at play right now. There is obviously the cookie deprecation that will happen, I guess, sometime. Supposed to be this year, maybe next year. It's going to happen at some time. There is also the fact that privacy regulations are becoming stronger over a period of time. There's also, we talked earlier about there being cross-country challenges in terms of data collaboration. There are also cross-sectoral challenges. So I think really understanding what are some of the key tenets of how businesses can collaborate within industries and across industries is something which is still a bit of a gray area. And therefore, I really want to start with you, Kenneth. And I thought that a good starting point would be for us to really look at it from a starting point, right? And telcos today sit on a plethora of data, right? Specifically given your path within telcos towards data monetization, what are some of the key areas where you see data as being strongly leveraged today and at your end? And I'm just going to call it customer data. And where do you also see there to be specific challenges? Just given, and I'll it's a very open-ended question. I thought I'll throw you straight in the ocean. So go for it.
Sure, thanks for the question. I think the question it's also a reflection of where we are in the telco industry. And I would kind of like, for those who are not in the telco industry, you will probably guess that telco have a lot of data. But you might not know that most of the data is thrown away, right? And we are not authorized to use the data for many use cases. So simple things like your call detail records, the websites you served, the data that you used for the surfing, all these are captured in call detail records and use it only for billing. So from a telco's perspective, we use it to make sure that you get the right bill and subtract it against the plan that you have. The secondary use case that we are authorized to use it for is for network optimization. For example, if there is a lot of folks that love to watch TikTok, right? And a lot of traffic going to TikTok, we might use it from a traffic engineering perspective to try to have better peering with TikTok, for example, right? So this is what a telco will use the data for. We are not allowed to monetize the data. We are not allowed to sell the data, and so on, because we sit on all the data, including network location, and all the data sites that you go to, right? And this became a problem in the industry. As you would have alluded to, the banking industry has a long history of collaboration through Basel frameworks and so on, how to exchange data, how to do interbank settlements and so on. But in the telco world, the only thing that telcos work with each other is roaming. You drive to Malaysia, a friendly telco would receive you and allow you to roam to the network. And that's the only thing that we have set up. Other frameworks are not set up for a simple reason. Like banks, telcos are very heavily regulated, so they are largely domestic in nature, especially for the mobile side of the business. And the other part is that telcos have really no reason to work with each other. Until about last year, there was a very huge rise of scam cases. And I'm sure if you are in Singapore, you would have kind of noted that our banking regulator, which is the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, and the telco regulators, IMDA, came together and threw it out there to the industry. How about you guys are jointly responsible for scams, right? Can you guys work together to find technologies, solutions such that the vulnerable, the elderly, do not get scammed through messages and so on? And yes, telcos, you are as liable as the banks if it's found that it's going through your medium. So that got us thinking, and we had some works in the progress to build up the APIs, and we realized that we need to collaborate with other telcos. If not, we couldn't get this solution out. We couldn't help the banks who requested for the information. We couldn't help the government agencies who needed information as well. The good news is that in the industry, the telco industry has actually an association called GSMA, which you probably have heard of, right? But may not know that it's very prominent. Its main job is to kind of come up with standards for things like 5G, and they have the 3GPP standards for that. But one of the things that they have also worked on was also something called the Open Gateway API Initiative, and also the Camara standards, where it tried to kind of simplify a telco and allowed certain APIs to be asked about a telco, right? You could ask about, a subscriber's network location. You could ask about, whether his credit rating is good because he paid his bills and so on. Now, however, the Camara APIs we cannot show raw data because we have now, exposed, privacy of an individual, right? So we have to kind of collate it together. So with the rise of the scams, Singtel was kind of pushed into this to determine what could we do better with the industry, with our fellow telco operators, with the telco operators in the region. How could we have used the data better to fight scams? And I think this is the awakening that we had. It's like, okay, we have to do something about it. If we don't, the banks would be left to their own devices, and they will not know whether the scammers are jumping from country to country, whether they are using multiple mobile phones, whether you're using mobile numbers, whether they're using desktops and so on. So we have to provide some part of that information, and that's where it all got started. And of course, when we got started in the journey, we realized many other issues as well, right? And therefore, we needed to find a way to kind of have the confidentiality protected amongst the different data owners, and how do they share data and aggregate and give a score, give a range. If a bank wanted to find out whether you are actually in Singapore, how do we give a yes and no answer, but not your actual location? So we started to come up with frameworks like that, right, through our Sync Verify API initiative. So if you are asking me, have we been using data well? The answer is, as a telco industry, we have not been using data well for the good of the industries. We've been using it for network planning, we're using it for billing. But in a way, thanks to the collective effort of the telco industry, we are coming together to try to bend around to solve the scam issues. And of course, with that, we can then now proliferate certain use cases in the banking industry, in e-commerce industries, mainly to fight fraud, but also with secondary use cases that can actually flow over to advertising and so on. Yeah.
I think that's, there are lots of interesting thoughts over there, and I just want to kind of lead from there. We will come back to potential use cases, and I think fraud is extremely relevant. But Ben, from your experience, just sort of drawing a similar, I guess, like just an extension to the ad tech industry. Firstly, when you look at data collaboration, I would love to get a perspective. One is company to user, right? Like how are companies typically within the broader social media ad tech space using data today differently than the way they were using data 3 years back? So, because specifically, I think the ad tech industry in particular, you look at Meta, you look at TikTok, you look at Snap, you look at these kind of companies, they do, I would believe, are a little more advanced in that journey, and therefore would love to understand how you've seen that evolving. And there is a follow-up question on the fact that are ad tech companies collaborating with each other?
Sure. I think the ad tech industry is still early on in this journey of evolving. These are very slow-moving things, and change is hard, change is painful. So for many, many decades, the way the industry has worked is there are these different websites that you visit on the internet, and every different website that you interact with has data about your interactions with that website. So you go to a website that's funded by ads, and you see the ads, and the website knows which ads it showed you. And then if you go to a different website and make a purchase, that website has information about what purchases people made. And so the need for the collaboration here is to compute this joint statistic, which is how many times did someone buy something because of an ad they were shown. But this requires collaboration between different websites, right? And so I guess the architecture of the internet wasn't really designed around privacy. Back in the early days when the internet was first getting started, there wasn't a formal privacy threat model. It just sort of grew organically. And so now the W3C has sort of recognized we need a formal privacy threat model. And it's a very painful and difficult and long journey to try to go like retrofit a privacy model after the fact. And so I think what you're seeing now is this many-year journey to slowly change sort of the fundamentals of the internet. And cookies is one of those things. Like when third-party cookies were developed, I don't think anyone really understood exactly how they would eventually be used. This is the tricky thing when you introduce like a really powerful, fundamental technology primitive, is it's hard to predict all the use cases for it. So I guess what we're now doing is trying to say, okay, what should be the privacy threat model for the internet? And a lot of people are saying, you know, sort of the Vegas rule. Like what you do on one site should stay with that site, right? But you know, advertising strictly requires this collaboration between sites. So I guess what we're talking about in the W3C is like, okay, there needs to be some data flows between different websites, but like what kinds of data flows are we all comfortable with? And I think the consensus is drifting towards aggregation. So if you're collecting an aggregate statistic about a population, particularly if we can make some strong statements about its inability to go get linked to individual people, that's where I think there's an enhanced comfort level. And so that's what we're trying to do, is design these APIs that enable those kind of like unlinkable aggregate statistics, that kind of collaboration. You mentioned in the last couple of years, sort of like evolution of the industry. I think what you've seen more and more from folks like Meta and Snap is this leaning into aggregated data, where you say, like, how can I evolve the way that I select and serve and measure ads to rely less and less on granular data and more on aggregate statistics?
That's interesting. So I guess I'm curious to know, like, what is driving what, right? So maybe Guy, I'll get you in over here. Ben's talking about aggregate data. There's also talk about how different players who are inherently competing with each other are also looking at collaborating and solving some, greater purpose. The question that I have is, like, from a technology perspective, is technology developing basis the requirements that are coming in from industry? Or is there a path where the tech innovation can actually drive the data rules, right? Like, what comes first? Because when I think about data aggregation, I'm pretty sure if you ask all these companies, they would love to use it at an individual level also, right? It's just like we don't have the frameworks right now. So I'm curious to know from a pure technology solution perspective, how are you seeing this? Is it almost the environment is evolving, I mean, coming with tech solutions, or is there actually enough innovation happening in this space?
Well, I think the technology is already there. It's been there for a few years at least. It's getting better and faster by the day. It can't do everything, but for example, when we talk about like aggregating statistics and stuff like that, I mean, there are already systems that are deployed at scale. I mean, there was a paper a few years ago called Prio, and then Mozilla took it, and they use it to aggregate like how often like different people on aggregate like visit websites, and like what are and other statistics and behavior patterns on how people use the web browser, specifically Firefox. I think Apple has similar initiatives, Google, Facebook for sure, Meta. So I think everyone is kind of looking at it and is seeing that it's actually scalable to like, global level population even. I don't think you can do everything there. I still think that there are some technical challenges to be solved, but generally speaking, like, if you're working on this now and you're truly intending to deploy it, then the tech is definitely there. I think the bigger challenges are maybe bureaucratic and on the non-technical side, and then on the technical side, they're a bit like integration-wise. So, these are usually kind of like new stacks that you need to develop, and then you need to integrate them with like existing systems, and that's usually where things get really hairy and complicated and take a lot of like effort and money to deploy. And quite frankly, like, if I'm like now you need to start bringing in these like consortiums and companies together and get them to agree on like a spec and get them to agree to kind of like put their man hours and effort to integrate with all of their systems. And like the business or the regulatory like needs to be so high for them to put that effort in order for that to make sense. And I think that, at least in my experience, that hasn't been the case, let's say 5 to 10 years ago. I think it's starting to be the case for two reasons. A is regulation, which I think is a double-edged sword in this case. But B also because I think people are getting a bit more conscious about it, and it's actually becoming a differentiating factor for big companies such that they actually want to put that effort.
So given what Guy mentioned, the fact that you talk about some of these spec technologies, when you presented something earlier, which is really keeping the focus on MPC and MPC-led solutions. I'm curious to know, at a company like Meta, what are some of the mainstream sort of ways in which you are using some of these technologies, specifically, a few examples, and maybe you can share a bit more on how you're using MPC as a solution. And what are some of the problems that you're looking at solving through that?
So like I shared earlier, this is really still at the proposal stage. if you're trying to design like a really privacy-preserving measurement system, I think you have to involve the web browsers and the web platform. It's just impossible or really difficult as a particular single website to build a good end-to-end system. But the browser's in this unique position where it has sort of this privileged access and sort of enhanced trust from the user. So if you involve the browser in trying to design an end-to-end privacy-preserving system, it's just far more powerful, and you have like a broader suite of solutions. So, that's why I'm so involved in these standards bodies like the W3C, because the browsers that everyone uses are Chrome and Safari and Firefox. So I have to talk to Apple and Google and Mozilla and Microsoft and all of them to try to persuade them to work together with us, to collaborate as an industry. So I guess I'm really focused on this sort of long-term future when we can reach consensus through a standards body on a privacy-preserving MPC-based standard. I think that'll be a really valuable thing. At the moment, what we're doing is this research around scalability, because like I mentioned earlier, the numbers are staggering. And yes, there are really, really great deployments like Prio today. But Prio is this very, very specific thing where you're just adding with range proofs. If you want to do some more complex or advanced things, particularly if you're trying to like train some kind of AI in MPC, that's going to be very expensive, especially compared to doing it in the clear. So the incremental cost is very, very large to move to that. So there's lots of research, I think, left to sort of bring down those costs and improve scalability.
So when the MPC itself has evolved over a period of time, right? And what makes it so much more effective than, I would say, even a decade back, is just that computational power is significantly more advanced. And what used to maybe take hours down to minutes is now taking literally milliseconds as things happen. So I kind of still want to just put it on the table that the technology has advanced, and therefore MPC adoption or similar such pet technologies, their adoption can happen. And therefore, again, throwing it back to both of you, who starts this when it comes to cross-industry collaboration, right? So maybe Kenneth, we'll start with you. You talked about the fact that clearly you see a use case, right? Fraud is, a big challenge. People, and I think we talked about it earlier, like there are signals, right, to certain behaviors. The moment you see one individual using maybe more than 7 to 10, SIM cards, it's automatically a red flag. 20 is a definite, there's a definite issue being used in a short period of time. And there are similar, I guess there's a similar thread when you think about collaboration between, Meta, which obviously, has access to over 1 billion people, and also browsers, which have access to potentially double that audience, right? How does this start? Because the technology, to Guy's point, is already there. So what are the starting points to this? And we can deep dive from there. Ken, maybe starting with you.
Okay, so from where I stand, there are two big players that made this happen, right? One is obviously regulatory and governments, and the purpose was always to kind of like fight scams, right? That's what got us all aligned. I mean, the tech is there, but whether you get funding internally to drive this as a business or drive this as a direction is always questionable. But when there is some form of intervention, especially when there is a bigger purpose, and it's not just Singapore that's having scams, it's Hong Kong, Indonesia, Malaysia, and for those of you who kind of understand a Singtel group, Singtel is actually an organization that is not just based in Singapore. We own 100% of Optus. We own 100% of Telkomsel in Indonesia. We have significant stakes in AIS in Thailand, Globe Telecom in Philippines. So we see the scam issue spread across the whole Southeast Asia. And it pains us to see our subscribers getting scammed. So that's the first one, right? Second, there's an important part that we play because we do have data that we could have helped the e-commerce company, the logistics company, the bank validate something, but we didn't because of hurdles, right? And because of that, the decided not to provide that information, but only realized later on that we could have actually provided some data that could have reduced the scams, right? So the other driver that is doing this is that actually, as a telco industry, we have been struggling with this API monetization for the longest time. This has been a decade-long issue. All telcos are thinking about how to do it, and they could only monetize it not in the consumer world, but in the enterprise world. So in the enterprise world, you have special SIM cards called IoT SIMs or M2M SIMs, machine-to-machine SIMs. And these SIMs are placed in devices, robots, even cars. If you drive an electric vehicle, if you drive a modern car, they all have some form of connectivity. And that connectivity is provided through a telco like Singtel, right? And we have lots of information because the in-car entertainment in the car gets its internet from somewhere. All the telemetry that the car provides back to the provider like BYD or Tesla comes from somewhere. And there are regulatory requirements that prevent how data is routed. For example, in Australia, they don't allow Chinese cars to send data back to China. The data has to be kept within Australia. Singapore has similar primitives as well. So there is IoT API monetization happening, but it's not at the consumer scale, right? So if you put the two together and say that, if I could identify where a car is to give it to the control center so that they know where the car breakdown is, why can't we use it to fight scams? And that's where, the kind of like the aha moment came in. And that's where the team came together and tried to find solutions. And we had to meet regulator requirements not to provide information that could identify a specific individual. So we had to craft API such a way that we provided yes/no answers, or we gave you a range. Like, for example, the network location API is something that we get from a range to 1 to 7, right? 1 being very close to where the location you thought he was, and 7 being very far away. Let me give you an example, right? So if a bank wanted to find out whether this person making a $100,000 transaction is indeed in, for example, at this location, right? Because on the mobile device, it seems that he is actually at the Park Royal. So he would ask the telco that, right, through an API. That telco cannot provide the actual location. We have the actual coordinates, but we cannot do that. So we'll give you a score from 1 to 7. And a score of 7 might mean that he's overseas. So if we reply you 7, the bank has every reason to believe that this transaction is done by an overseas person, and the SIM that was supposed to be in Singapore is actually not in Singapore. Now, does it mean that it's a scam? No, it does not mean that it's a scam. But we gave one signal to the bank that could lead them to suspect that this could be a fraudulent transaction, right? The second question that the bank could ask is that, okay, is this number part of a scam list, right? Now, the reason why they could ask that is that, does the signal of this particular phone number, does he make a lot of calls? Does he receive a lot of calls? Is he a victim or is he a scammer, right? So if you have made like 100,000 calls in 1 week, that's a big anomaly, right? Especially if the 100,000 calls were unique numbers. So we could provide data like that, but we have to give it in aggregates and in certain codes so that you can't actually tell whether this person is really like a telemarketer or a very good insurance salesperson, right? Or versus a scammer. So we have to give some signals, and they can make that assumption and then decide whether it's a fraudulent transaction and prefer to send a signal to the transaction owner, please come to the branch to do the transaction, right? So this is how we all got started, and that's how the two, I would say that the two tracks kind of met, and that's how we got started in this. And therefore, it gave us a lot of opportunity to work with banks, to e-commerce companies, to logistic companies, and fintech companies as well. Yeah.
Guy, I'm curious to get your perspective on two things. One, as as a technology provider, how do you implement solutions when there are a lot of, I would say, a lot of dependencies, right? What would be a starting point for, say, implementing a pet technology or a pet solution across a very, very regulated environment where there is a lot of education required around how, data is protected, et cetera, et cetera. Like how from your own experience, you've seen, like, what are some of the key hurdles and what is the path towards potential implementation, albeit even in a controlled environment, but what have you seen from your experience?
This might be a bit unpopular. When I started this like 10 years ago, working on pets and NPC specifically, I was very excited because like I was a grad student back then as well. MIT is a good brand. He has a lot of connections. My professor is like pretty much on the board of like so many big companies. So we got immediately connected to everyone, including like US Treasury, Australian regulator, like a lot of like big names. And we had so many conversations. The excitement around pets was like so big, and around the need, and very similar things came up, right? Like you need to fight fraud. We also had like different telcos combining data who need to fight fraud back then and all that. It's been the same rhythm. Yes, the technology was not quite there as now. It wasn't even like as well understood. Like I always had to kind of like explain what MPC is, and today that's usually not an issue. But the thing is that those conversations either ended up nowhere, at least back then, quite frankly, or they ended in very long pilots that usually did not materialize. Now, this is 10 years ago, and today the situation is way, way better. There's actually serious people in those companies like that are championing these, that are working very hard to make it happen, that have the right knowledge and capabilities. So it's very different. But from my perspective, at least, I took a different direction, which I still think is a very valuable one. There's one industry that's been adopting like new technologies like crazy, and it's like the perfect test bed because people are actually enthusiastic about trying it even before everything is put in place, and that is the blockchain industry. So I've known many academics and people in industry and all that who simply went to the public, blockchain area. I mean, just look at Zcash, right? Like I don't think zero knowledge would have been where it is today, where people in Web 2 and in large companies would actually think about seriously deploying it in like real world systems, to fight things like fake data and like fake news and stuff like that. Like no one would have thought about it if they hadn't seen it being mass adopted in an industry that really took it in, like the blockchain industry. So to me, like one direction, and at least that's the direction I'm taking, is I want to get these technologies like MPC, like FHE, all those like serious TEs with secret network, like really seriously adopted at scale in that industry, in the blockchain industry, before we take it further. At least that's my vantage point to the situation.
Ben, your reaction to this? Is it a fair point? I do hear this often that when it comes to adoption of not just pet, but other technologies which have still not got mainstream adoption, the path to, I wouldn't say adoption, but definitely the path to acceptance is significantly faster when it comes to blockchain and the broader Web3 space. That can also be a mindset. That can also be to the point that there could be businesses that are more agile, but also that adoption is typically, and maybe I'm stereotyping over here, but typically faster even for companies that are well established within that space. So I'm not just talking about a startup out there, but like well established. Would you agree?
I mean, I'm no expert on blockchain. I've had no involvement in that whole industry, but there are definitely a lot of challenges to adoption for existing companies, particularly who are in regulated industries. And advertising is increasingly becoming more and more regulated. I think especially when you have like a really large P&L and like a large existing business, it's just difficult to move. Yes, the technology is pretty mature. I think it's fairly scalable. And most of the challenges are in things like contracts. So if you want to use MPC and you want to have a delegated MPC run by some consortium of helper parties, what is the legal mechanism that you set up as the governance body over that? And how does that intersect with existing regulation? And I think that that is not clear. So a lot of my time these days is dedicated towards engaging with regulators to discuss like how do these laws apply to this kind of weird and different situation that you might not have ever thought about before, actually. And I don't think it's very obvious, like exactly how existing regulation applies. Like from my perspective, if I send you a secret share, I have not sent you personal information. I have sent you a random number which can't possibly be reverse engineered into anything, no matter how hard you try, even if you have infinite time and infinite computational resources. You would need to go collude together with the other helper parties. But like, that's kind of this interesting setting, right? How do you create a non-collusion contract? Like, I'm not sure. And how do existing privacy regulators deem the transfer of encrypted secret shares? Do they agree with me that that's like not a transfer of personal information? Do they also agree that that's like anonymous information or not? If you involve the device and have the device be making up numbers or performing secret sharing and doing anonymization and things, how does that intersect with older laws that were written a long time, probably when people had very, very little concept of these even potential, like e-privacy? That's like a really interesting question. Like, what is the intersection there? Because that sort of mandates like a cookie banner, and like, no one really likes cookie banners. No one thinks this is actually like making the world a wonderful place because we have these cookie banners. But like, there's a lot of these weird, complicated regulatory questions left to work out that I think are the more significant blockers to adoption, but also like this huge cost increase, right? If you're doing something in MPC, it's going to be at least 100 times more expensive than if you were doing it in the clear. And that's like optimistic, right? So, I mean, I don't have the exact number of how much Meta spends on its data centers, but it's like it's a large number. And you can't multiply that by 100 and remain a profitable business, right? So I think you do need this forcing function, and you do need this collaborative approach, working together with regulators to clarify how do they want their regulations to apply to privacy-enhancing technologies. So those are the bigger blockers I see.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So I'm always interested to know, and feel free, I mean, this is your respective individual opinions, but I'm curious to know, starting with you, Ben, would you see privacy-enhancing technologies or the broader privacy in the top 3 agendas for social media companies? Would it fit there?
I don't know. I am personally really passionate about privacy-enhancing technologies, and it's the focus of my work. But I still think a lot of people view it as a little bit of a long-term play. Like, a lot of the folks that I work with are focused on more sort of near-term objectives, and this is sort of a longer-term objective. A lot of that's because I'm engaging through standards bodies, and standards bodies move very slowly, you know? And it's a consensus-driven organization, so you have to somehow reach consensus with a whole bunch of folks that, you know, I don't work at their companies. I can't make them do anything. All I can do is talk and hopefully convince them to agree on a path forward. So we have a lot less leverage, and it's going to be more of a community-driven approach. So I think that lack of control makes it hard to prioritize sometimes.
Kenneth, telcos, would it be then the top 3 priorities?
So the interesting thing that you probably may not have glimpsed from the past conversations that I had is that Singtel never sought out pets. It was a problem that we had, and pets was one of the solutions that potentially could have eradicated the problem, right? So the problem was, how do we have trust or digital trust across competition and collaborators in a form that is acceptable to everyone. And via the existing frameworks of APIs, it's not possible. Because if I open an API to you, I have no way to understand your intent. If you wanted to get a network location of a number, if you had the money, you can just call the API nonstop. But if you use it to feed it into a marketing engine, I couldn't stop you. But what if I only wanted you to use it for fraud? How would I convince my competitors to also do the same? So it kind of, it was a problem that required a solution, and PETs, kind of like conveniently floated into the picture. So if you ask me honestly, does Singtel have a strategic view, a short-term view of PETs and technologies? The answer is we didn't actually have one. But we had problem statements that we needed fixed, and PETs came into the picture, and we'll be exploring PETs to see how it can resolve our problems. Yep.
Interesting. Guy, do you think a lot of PET and similar technologies are good to have, but not really a priority until shit hits the roof? So is it one of those?
In whose view?
So from a technology provider's perspective, do you ever see when you're engaging with different partners that it does rank as a top priority? So
I think it's not a top priority right now. It's a high priority, which is, to me, even that is surprising, right? It was literally no priority. It was a curiosity until just a few years ago. So the fact that it is even becoming a priority is really good news. I kind of agree with my co-panelists here that it's not a top priority right now. To me, there needs to happen like one or two things for it to become a top priority. So the technology needs to, the cost of the technology, I mean, it can be 100x, right? We need to drive the technology costs down. And maybe we take a bit more assumptions to do that because there are also limits, but like we need to find a balance where there's a reasonable markup in price that is not that big such that, it becomes the top priority. That's option number one. Option number two is from the other end. The value, like you reach some use case, some example, something where the value that the technology creates, monetary-wise, is like so big that it outpaces the extra costs, right? Like we've seen that with like kind of like the green energy movement, and then that led us to like electric cars, and it seemed like a cost item, but right, companies like Tesla and others, I mean, putting your opinion about them aside, I mean, they turn it into a viable business. So if you can turn this into a viable business, even if the costs are higher, still we gotta drive them down a bit, then those two would make them like a top priority for pretty much everyone.
And that's a perfect segue for what I wanted to ask, or rather put on the table, that a lot of themes that are coming through right now when we're talking about pets is very preventive, right? Like we want to deploy this because there's a problem out there and we want to try and prevent that problem from happening. Or there is some other issue there and we want to prevent that from happening. But today, pets actually have multiple ways through which you can look at monetizing your business. And therefore, to your point, pets may come at a cost, but if the revenue or the paths of monetization are well beyond that, the technology pays for itself. So love to hear a few examples, if there are any, in terms of how you do believe, maybe starting with you, Ben, how do you see pets can be adopted to drive monetization in the broader AgTech sector? And then maybe Kenneth, love to hear your perspective too.
So one way I see is current advertising requires businesses to basically share data. Share data about transactions that are happening that they can then go ask to be tied back to their ads revenue to help optimize their ad spend and get better results. And some businesses, for various reasons, are either unwilling or unable or feel the compliance costs are too high, and so they don't engage in data sharing. And if you just buy ads without transferring any data, like you can do that and you'll probably have very poor performance. So if we can use pets to eliminate the need for data transfer and instead say we can compute these useful aggregate statistics that improve your ad performance, that everyone agrees this is not a data transfer. Like, no one is learning the personal information of individuals. That could potentially open up a path to data-driven advertising and higher performance for a large number of businesses that today don't feel comfortable. So I think that's one possible future I can see that I'm really excited about.
Okay, from a telco perspective, location data is always very valuable. And location data is one information that could be used in multiple industries. Parts of my conversation earlier was always talking about fighting fraud, but location data can also be used for smart city planning, evacuations when there are emergencies, especially when there's a large venue and there are a lot of people that need to evacuate. How do you give them wayfinding instructions to get to the closest, safest evacuation point? So there are many, many use cases that are of national interest for facility owners. The other part that comes in is also probably for marketing, and this has always been a decade-old problem. Can you monetize marketing real-time offers if you're in a location? Like, for example, if you happen to walk past Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? And this guy loves his fried chicken. Why don't you give him an offer? If you drop into KFC, 5% off your favorite fried chicken. So it's definitely possible. So if you ask me, location data, apart from enterprise use cases like cars, machinery, robots, for the man in the street, there's a lot of use cases and could improve a lot of industries. Today, the data is very safeguarded and it's always aggregated and therefore does not provide actionable insights to the particular individual. But when we allow the federation of data and sharing of data across telcos, I think that would be really reimagining quite a lot of industries. So I think that I look forward to a combination of physical and digital interactions. Because in the browser space, it's all digital, right? But a human walks with his phone. The physical, digital world interacts. I think there's a lot of possibilities that can happen, right?
That's interesting. I think in the earlier panel, we, for example, had a very interesting use case, which was the team at Silence Laboratories working with the Bank of International Settlements to essentially enable collaboration across 4 different banks in 4 different countries. And clearly there was a theme discussed about data move, like how do you monetize in a way that data actually does not have to move? So Guy, any additional use cases that you feel could be extremely relevant as good starting points where, I guess the starting point is that businesses would not want data to move?
So I can agree with you that what is the definition of data moving, right? Like if I send a secret share that's been perfectly randomized, has data really moved? I think actually that's one of the bigger hurdles to adoption, kind of like explaining that and then getting that stamp of approval of that definition. I've actually had interactions with companies that because of that lack of definition, they were like, I don't know if this is GDPR compliant or not. So I think that's one big issue. I think 2 interesting examples that come to mind. I mean, there are many more, and the setting may differ. So, not sure it fits exactly your question, but I still think that authentication is big, right? As you guys know, as we've seen with the blockchain space, just the ability to split your key and then have different levels of security, sorry, per key share, and all that. That increases security so much, and there's no reason that authentication mechanism just works for, blockchain. It can work for everywhere, every server, every I don't know, database, everything that you hold and that you need to have access keys to, and you need to have some, access control policy. You need to have some kind of mechanism to better protect it than just, having one HSM like holding the key. So I think that's still a big use case, and I think that it's underused beyond blockchain. In fact, there's one company, I forget the name, the company that got sold to Coinbase, right? Like they started from the Web 2 industry, they moved to Web 3, that's where they found success, but the need is in Web 2 as well. The need is pretty much everywhere when it comes to authentication, and that is easily done. It doesn't require so much integration. There's no reason why it shouldn't happen. So that's example number one. Another example I'm kind of curious about is, we have these LLMs now. They're very powerful. They're trained on public data, like I'm putting IP questions on the other side that's like beyond me. Meta is actually releasing them in open source, so you actually have a community building them. But one of the limitations that I feel of like these models is that, they are very great at like anything that they find publicly on the internet. But then if they need like specific context, and that specific context might just be some very, very private database, right? Like you have in Singapore, you have different telcos, they have different data, the data that only they know. Obviously, those LLMs cannot be trained on them. But, if you can kind of plug those databases into those LLMs to kind of feed them like extra context, right? They will hallucinate less, they will give you more proper answers for different use cases. And that's usually known, if people are technical, it's usually known as RAG, like retrieval augmented generation. And the idea is that like if you take a public LLM and combine it with some private database, and that private database might be secret shared from like different parties, different owners, then suddenly you can actually increase the value, because like retrieval from those databases is not that expensive. Like you can do that today. It's not like putting the whole LLM in like MPC or something. But now you can supercharge those LLMs with private data. And now those companies, the people, consumers, like they start to have interest to share data, because if we share data, we know that our own data remains private because it's like secret shared or encrypted or whatever. And only the LLM has, using some pet way to access that data for context to bring better answers, then to me that's like super interesting, because now we actually start to get more power into these LLMs and more value for whoever is consuming them.
Any thoughts? Any thoughts? I did see you, Kenneth, nodding along. So
I mean, it's a very interesting idea, obviously. We all have this dream, right? Public domain knowledge, it's only as rich as what they can find on the internet, but there's a lot of enterprise data or even personal data that is very, very key to put the whole entire context together to give you a very accurate reply. And the main reason why pets are necessary is because people don't feel comfortable in sharing the enterprise data, right? And this is true for almost all industry, especially regulated industries. So I think pets is a technology enabler, but there's a lot of work to be done across the regulatory framework to see, if we can set this up, in the kind of collaborative manner. I see that more as a stumbling block than the technology. The technology has a lot of great people in the room here who have a lot of ideas, but they walk out the room unable to execute because of the regulatory framework sometimes, right? And I think this is, 2024 is the right time and right place in the year that, we are going to tip towards the favor of pets, in the sense that with pets getting more and more deployed, we'll start to see a lot of use cases, and it might cross into the domain of LLMs and AI, and I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in this area. So I think of this as sort of private fine-tuning, where if you have a public AI and you want to fine-tune it using private information, I do think that's a really sweet spot for MPC, because you can skip a lot of that workload of doing the sort of basic training. And I think that's where we might be able to reach that balance point between cost and value that you were talking about earlier. We published a little paper about how to do private logistic regression, which definitely lends itself to MPC because it's just multiplications and additions. So you can do that pretty easily. And if you have private logistic regression, that's a very simplistic form of sort of private fine-tuning. Yeah. But I'm definitely interested in doing more advanced, more complex things that require things. And I think this code that we've been working on for this sort of generic three-party honest majority malicious Boolean circuits could easily be applied to other use cases like training AIs. So I think this idea of training an AI on private data is a great example of an aggregate statistic that could lend itself quite well to MPC. So I'm interested in trying to publish open source technology out there that people can use with no IP restrictions so they can go and explore and play around with that.
Curious to know if I think just on the technology bit, maybe Guy, you can talk a bit more about this. How would you differentiate a MPC solution as compared to a data clean room? I mean, a data clean room also enables collaboration, right? So how do you educate the market or educate different businesses on where does that difference lie? Because businesses also have certain ways, certain set systems and processes. They already have that running. And often you hear from companies, and I'd love for you also, Ben, to pitch into this. Like, we already have this running. We already have a data clean room. There is some collaboration happening. We're kind of getting what we want. So why should we adopt a new technology? It's probably going to be more expensive, probably not coming from a very established name. How do you actually address that? And what's the fundamental difference? And is there actually a need? Is there a market out there?
This boils down to personal belief, but if you go back 150 years ago, people said we have horses, why do we need cars? And sure, they have the existing processes, and it's going to take time to change them. It's going to take time to build trust, especially if you're a no brand or a small brand compared to them. So I don't think this happens overnight, but at the end of the day, these processes and these ways to do it that are filled with bureaucracy, sprinkled with a little of very simple technology, and then with legal, and then with all of the other stuff. I think these are okay, but they don't scale, and they're clearly there's a 10, 100x better way to solve it with technology. The technology still has to improve. We need to educate. We need time for that to happen. But eventually, I think it's going to be a no-brainer. Even though people don't understand it now, I mean, do you really think 20 years ago this would be a valid argument? I personally don't think so.
I think the thing about data clean rooms is that's not a clearly defined term. That means a lot of different things depending on who's saying those words. So I've seen some people on the one extreme try to go to a really good extent to safeguard data in a clean room by, for example, running everything in trusted execution environments and ensuring that all the data that comes out is aggregated and has differentially private random noise added to it and things like that. But there's also another extreme where a data clean room is essentially a trusted third party. And two organizations both trust the data clean room, so they both transfer raw data to a data clean room who just processes things in the clear. So I think it's such a wide spectrum. And some people are using it to do aggregate statistics, and some people talk about using data clean rooms for enriching their existing data sets, which sort of doesn't compute to me because that sounds like it's releasing user-level data out of the system. So this is not a standardized term. If we had a standardized definition of what is a data clean room, it'd be a lot easier to talk about this. In terms of, what does the market need that would force people to use something beyond a data clean room? I think it's going to probably come down to regulation. If an organization is using a data clean room today because they believe that it puts them in compliance with some kind of existing regulation, then they're not going to want to move to a more complex or more latent or more expensive solution unless someone tells them that for whatever reason, their existing solution is insufficient and something else is. But you're going to have, I think, a level of clarity that doesn't exist today. Today, I don't think there's this super clear answer that you'll get from a privacy regulator saying this type of PET would be the minimum requirement for this reason. That just doesn't exist. So it's going to be up to interpretations of your own legal team to try to assess for yourself, like, what is the bar, what is necessary.
So given this, Kenneth, do you see there to be specific use cases where there could be some data or some computation that needs to happen at your end where let's simply the organization would not feel very comfortable sending that data and definitely not feel comfortable sending it to a third party, which probably also has access to similar data. Are there such use cases in the business?
Probably let me first kind of give you an employee's view of Singtel's data governance regulations. So if you are an employee, you are a data owner, you are a product owner, you are a marketeer in Singtel, these are the rules that are going to be enforced on you. You are not able to take any data out first. And any data that needs to go out for some reason or another must go through a very huge approval process, and all PII data will be cleansed. Will be. Which sometimes leaves the data in a state that it cannot be easily used. Right? So the concept of a clean room, if it does exist, will receive part of that data, and usually the data will be aggregated. So you can't run very soul-searching queries on that kind of data as well. So PET MPCs come in at the right time because our regulations in Singtel are very, very punitive, right? You're not allowed to do many things. Because of that, I think PETs come in at the right time to enable computational of encrypted data, but without sending the data out. So I think it comes in very nicely to organizations that are heavily regulated. So if you ask me from my perspective, I think it's come in at the right time, and especially so in industries where they need to share data together. And there's a lot of discomfort in sharing the data, but they need to find a way to kind of share data. So I think it's at the right time.
So I know we're almost at time. Two things I wanted to just do a quick sense check. Guy, I definitely, from your experience, do hear the theme that there's a lot of change that is required, specifically from a bureaucratic point of view. In your experience, who or what vertical is the decision maker within these organizations that is advocating for these changes? Is it the revenue? Is it a CSO? Is it it could be all of them, it could be none of them?
In my experience, this is a people's game. You need someone who has decision-making power, but is also willing to be a champion. Whatever the title is, they can't just be unfortunately, you're lowest level engineer, but it needs to be someone with access to the organization and that's willing to champion this and actually not put their career at risk. This is not the stakes we're talking at, but put the effort that's needed to push this forward.
Ben, who would be driving this change at an organizational level towards execution? Do you see this more as something coming first from a technology point of view? Is it a monetization? Where do you see it starting?
Meta's a really data-driven company. So I think it's just very logical and very rational, where when the case is clear that the benefits outweigh the costs, the organization will likely make the decision. So in the meantime, there's continued research, investment, and monitoring just the existing environment and how things change in terms of the forcing functions. But I guess I'm one of those champions internally who's trying to push things forward. I'm a part of the monetization organization at Meta, so monetization I think is one of the lead driving factors, the other one being the privacy organization.
Okay. Kenneth?
It's true that the monetization part of the business, I would say, is the strongest voice. Usually, the monetization part of the business has dreams and goals that can only be met by certain technologies. But I would just go back to my very first statement when I kind of opened up this panel. It's the reality is that there must be a bigger cost that brings the industry together. You see, you can have the best monetization team within your organization. I can the best team in Singtel, but the rest of the other telcos are not aligned. It just doesn't come together. And frankly speaking, it's not a technology that is implemented by one company. It is technology that must be implemented by an ecosystem or community. So the word community means that there must be a certain purpose. Why is the community formed? So I talked about fighting scams and fraud. It has become, our reason to exist. Why the APIs are for? Because when we had these APIs, it's like, yeah, what's the use case apart from having robots and driverless cars and robot taxis? Why are we doing the APIs for, right? And scams gave us the reason why we should actually collaborate, and that's the reason why we're looking at PETs. So I think it's a bigger cost that needs to happen, and I think it's fairly unique in Singapore that we have this, where the regulators in the finance industry and the telco industry has came together to try to bring these two industries and make them responsible also for the for fighting scams, right? So I think this is also, I would say, a very important shift in the industry compared to maybe other jurisdictions.
That's I think that's a great way of winding this conversation up. I do appreciate the fact that I think we're striving for a big cause, to your point, Kenneth. And I think clearly there is something about identifying the right business case. We talked about that it's a technology which it's been around, yet it's new and novel. It comes at a cost, but I think the more clearly, one theme which is coming through is like, if there is a path towards monetization, I think the technology pays for itself. So I think lots of interesting points. We can probably keep going on and on about this, but look, really appreciate the different perspectives. Thank you so much for this. A round of applause for the team, please. Thank you.